Rise in the morning.
They weren't just singers. They weren't just faces on disco posters. The Bee Gees were storytellers who defined entire decades of music. Their harmonies could lift a dance floor into ecstasy or break a heart with one whispered line. But what happens when the very style that made you the biggest band in the world threatens to erase your legacy? This is the story of how the Bee Gees fought back against being trapped in the disco box, and with one unforgettable ballad, proved that their music was timeless.
In the morning sun.
By the mid-70s, the Bee Gees were everywhere. Their songs were blasting from car radios, dominating nightclubs, and soundtracking a cultural moment that was bigger than anyone could have predicted. Staying Alive, Night Fever, You Should Be Dancing. These weren't just hits, they were the heartbeat of the disco era. To millions, the Gibb brothers were untouchable icons, the faces of a movement that kept the world spinning under glittering lights. But behind the fame, there was a problem. The same music that made them global superstars also put them in a box. They weren't being seen as songwriters anymore, but as a fad. The world was starting to believe the Bee Gees were nothing more than disco kings, and fads don't last forever. This label was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, disco had catapulted them into heights most artists could only dream of. On the other hand, it erased their deeper identity. Long before the dance floors, the Bee Gees were balladeers, storytellers, and craftsmen who wrote songs with raw emotion and haunting melodies. Tracks like Massachusetts and To Love Somebody had cemented their reputation in the 60s as masters of heartfelt ballads. Yet now, the same industry that once praised their artistry only wanted more four-on-the-floor rhythms, more falsetto hooks, more shiny disco beats. The Bee Gees had become prisoners of their own success. For Barry, Robin, and Morris, this wasn't just a branding issue. It was an existential crisis. They weren't content with being typecast as a disco machine. They knew they had more to say, more to prove. And as whispers of disco fatigue grew louder in the cultural background, they realized something crucial. If they didn't break free of the label soon, they'd go down with the genre. But how do you fight back when the world thinks it knows exactly who you are? For the Bee Gees, the answer was to remind everyone of their roots. The brothers had always seen themselves as songwriters first, performers second. Their craft went beyond trends and mirrored something more timeless, melody. And in Barry's mind, melody was eternal. Fashions come and go, but a great melody will live forever. That conviction became the compass that guided their next move. They didn't need another dance anthem. They didn't need another chart-topping groove. They needed a song that could strip away the glitter and speak directly to the human heart. A song that would silence critics with one note and remind the world exactly who the Bee Gees were. And so, in the midst of disco's flashing lights and pulsing beats, the brothers began sketching the outline of something no one expected, a ballad.
Your eyes in the morning.
The turning point came when Barry Gibb began experimenting with a softer, more restrained vocal line. After years of pushing his falsetto into the spotlight, he wanted to go back to something rawer, more intimate. Robin and Maurice immediately felt the same pull. They all knew they needed a song that would take the Bee Gees out of the nightclubs and back into the quiet corners of the human soul. That idea started to take shape in the early sketches of what would become How Deep Is Your Love. Unlike the pulsing energy of Jive Talkin' or Night Fever, this was a melody built on tenderness. A slow, steady rhythm, gentle chords, and harmonies that felt like whispers in the dark. It was a direct rejection of what the world had come to expect from the Bee Gees. And precisely because of that, it was revolutionary. At the time, however, going down this path wasn't without risk. The Bee Gees had just delivered one of the biggest cultural phenomena in music history with Saturday Night Fever. Audiences were still hungry for more disco, more hits that made them move. A ballad, no matter how beautiful, could have been seen as a step backward. But the brothers believed in their instincts. They trusted that people would remember them not just as hitmakers, but as artists. The songwriting process itself was intense but natural. Barry described the melody as something that seemed to flow almost effortlessly, as if it had been waiting for them to discover it. Robin added lyrical fragments that gave the song its sense of yearning, while Maurice worked on grounding the arrangement with delicate textures. Together, they sculpted a ballad that carried both vulnerability and strength, a perfect reminder of their ability to connect on a deeply emotional level. When they first played the song to producers, The reaction was immediate. This wasn't just another track. This was something bigger. A love song, yes, but one that tapped into universal themes of trust, longing, and devotion. It felt timeless from the very beginning, almost as if it had always existed, and the Bee Gees had simply uncovered it. Still, the brothers knew the release would be tricky. Would the audience embrace this side of them again, or had the Disco Kings label stuck too firmly? Barry, ever the visionary, pushed forward with confidence. His philosophy was simple: the world might dance to a trend, but it will always return to melody. And if the melody is strong enough, it can break any box. When How Deep Is Your Love was finally recorded, the track sounded nothing like what was dominating radio at the time. It was slower, more reflective, drenched in harmony, and yet that was its power. The song didn't need to compete with the frenzy of the dance floor. It simply needed to stand still and let listeners come to it. When How Deep Is Your Love was finally released in 1977, it arrived at a cultural crossroads. Disco was still dominating the charts, and the Bee Gees were at the center of it all. But the backlash was starting to bubble under the surface. Critics had begun dismissing disco as shallow, formulaic, even disposable. The timing couldn't have been more critical. If the Bee Gees released yet another disco anthem, they risked confirming every stereotype about their supposed limitations. Instead, they did the opposite. The song slowly crept onto the airwaves, and almost immediately, people felt something different. Gone were the pounding bass lines and relentless rhythms of the dance floor. In their place was a song that sounded deeply personal, almost intimate, like a whispered confession. It was the Bee Gees as they had once been. Songwriters first, trendsetters second. The melody unfolded gently, each harmony carefully layered to create a sense of warmth and vulnerability. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about sincerity. Audiences responded with overwhelming emotion. Couples adopted the song as their song. Radio DJs praised it for standing apart from the crowd. Even skeptics of disco couldn't deny the beauty of the composition. For a moment, it didn't matter whether you loved or hated the disco craze. How Deep Is Your Love transcended all of it. The success of the single was undeniable. It shot up the charts, becoming one of the Bee Gees' most beloved and enduring hits. But more importantly, it reshaped how people saw them. They weren't just the kings of falsetto anthems and flashing dance floors. They were versatile artists who could still break your heart with a ballad. That versatility is what kept the Bee Gees from being swept away when disco eventually collapsed. Critics who had been quick to pigeonhole them as a fad were forced to reconsider. Reviewers highlighted the track as proof that the Bee Gees' talent was bigger than any single genre. And in a sense, How Deep Is Your Love became their shield against the coming storm. Disco would burn bright and fast, but the Bee Gees had planted their flag in something timeless. Looking back, it's almost ironic. The very song that might have seemed too soft or too slow to compete with disco ended up being their saving grace. It preserved their reputation not just as performers of an era, but as musicians with lasting impact. And as the backlash against disco grew harsher in the late 70s, that ballad stood as undeniable evidence of the Bee Gees' depth. As the years passed, How Deep Is Your Love only grew in stature. While many songs of the disco era became dated relics, this ballad remained evergreen. It found its way into weddings, anniversaries, and countless love stories. Generations who weren't even alive when it first topped the charts discovered it later and felt the same connection. That's the ultimate measure of timeless music, when it escapes its decade and becomes part of human memory itself. The Bee Gees, of course, continue to dominate with tracks like Stayin' Alive and Night Fever. Those songs defined the sound of the late 70s and became cultural touchstones. But if you look closely at their catalog, How Deep Is Your Love holds a special place. It's the heart beating quietly beneath all the flash and glitter. It's the track that whispers, "We are more than this moment. We are here to stay." What makes the song so remarkable is how it captures the essence of the Bee Gees' artistry. Their ability to harmonize was unmatched, but harmonies alone don't create magic. It was the emotion behind those harmonies that mattered. When Barry's voice rises on the chorus, when Robin and Morris weave their parts around his lead, you feel the honesty. They weren't just singing words on a page. They were pouring themselves into every note. That sincerity is what listeners hold on to decade after decade. Even today, you can hear echoes of How Deep Is Your Love in modern ballads. artists across genres cite the Bee Gees as an influence, and this particular song has been covered and reinterpreted by countless performers. From R&B singers to pop stars, musicians keep returning to it, drawn by its haunting melody and emotional clarity. Each new version proves the song's resilience. No matter the arrangement, the heart of it never fades. Culturally, the track also served a symbolic purpose. It reminded people that the Bee Gees weren't outsiders parachuting into disco for profit. They were seasoned songwriters who had weathered the shifting tides of the music industry for over a decade. Their survival depended on their ability to reinvent themselves. But reinvention doesn't mean abandoning core strengths. How Deep Is Your Love was the bridge between their past and their future, between their folk pop roots and their disco dominance. As the disco backlash of the late 70s intensified, with events like Disco Demolition Night casting a shadow over the genre, many artists saw their careers crumble. The Bee Gees weren't spared from criticism, but the presence of songs like How Deep Is Your Love softened the blow. It was a reminder to both fans and critics that they were more than a fad. They were craftsmen who knew how to write melodies that could touch souls. And perhaps that's why the song continues to resonate. It's not just a ballad, it's a survival story, a testament to resilience. In a way, it's the Bee Gees themselves set to music, enduring, adaptable, and eternally relevant. When you hear it now, decades later, it doesn't feel like nostalgia. It feels current, alive, as though it was written just yesterday. That's the mark of a true classic. Today, when we look back at the legacy of the Bee Gees, How Deep Is Your Love stands as one of the brightest jewels in their crown. While Stayin' Alive and Night Fever became anthems of the disco craze, this ballad occupies a different space, one untouched by time, trends, or shifting cultural moods. It's not simply a love song. It's a universal statement about vulnerability, connection, and trust. And that's why, decades later, it still plays at weddings, still sparks emotion in quiet car rides, and still stops listeners in their tracks the very moment those first notes begin to play. The endurance of the song tells us something deeper about the Bee Gees themselves. Their success was never just about chasing trends or being in the right place at the right time. It was about heart. Barry, Robin, and Morris understood that at the core of every great piece of music lies a simple question: does it make you feel something real? How Deep Is Your Love answered that question with a resounding yes. Every harmony, every carefully chosen lyric was designed to pull at emotions in a way that no dance beat ever could. And that's why, long after disco's glitter faded, the song remained unshakable. What's remarkable is how often this track resurfaces in culture. Whether it's being covered by new artists, featured in films and TV shows, or rediscovered by younger generations through streaming platforms, How Deep Is Your Love keeps finding new audiences. Each time it does, it reinforces the idea that true artistry is not bound by the decade in which it was created. Just as Frank Sinatra's ballads transcended the swing era, the Bee Gees' ballads continue to move hearts long after disco is gone. This is the definition of timelessness. The song also works as a reminder of the Bee Gees' resilience. When the storm of the disco backlash hit, countless artists who were tied too tightly to the genre saw their careers collapse almost overnight. Radio stations banned disco, records were burned, and critics tried to erase an entire movement from musical history. Yet the Bee Gees endured. Why? Because they had proof that they were more than a fad. How Deep Is Your Love stood like a shield in the middle of the chaos. Evidence that they were not just disco kings, but master songwriters whose music would always matter. There's another dimension to consider: the personal bond of the Gibb brothers themselves. For all their fame, fortune, and occasional feuds, what kept them moving forward was their connection to each other. In many ways, How Deep Is Your Love can be seen not just as a love song to a partner, but also as a reflection of their own unity as brothers and collaborators. It's a song that speaks of loyalty, trust, and faith in one another, themes that mirrored the foundation of their careers. Without that bond, they could never have survived the shifting tides of the music industry. And perhaps that is why the song resonates so powerfully today. It's about more than romance. It's about connection in the deepest sense, the kind of connection that sustains you when the world is quick to cast you aside. That's why the lyrics feel just as fresh now as they did in 1977. That's why a teenager hearing it for the first time can feel the same rush of emotion as someone who danced to it on release day. It bridges generations, linking hearts across time. In the end, How Deep Is Your Love is more than a song. It's a symbol of survival, of reinvention, and of artistry that defies categories. The Bee Gees could have been remembered only as the faces of disco, burned away by the backlash. Instead, because of this one ballad, their legacy was secured as something greater. Timeless storytellers who understood that melody and emotion will always outlast fashion. So, when you hear those opening notes, you're not just listening to a ballad from 1977. You're hearing the Bee Gees' answer to the world's doubt, their refusal to be caged by trends, and their reminder that love, deep, enduring, and true, never fades. And in that sense, How Deep Is Your Love will forever be the song that saved the Bee Gees and proved that sincerity is the most powerful force in music. If this story moved you, hit the like button, share it with someone who loves classic music, and subscribe for more journeys into the timeless tracks that shape generations. After all, great music never dies, and neither do the stories behind it.